Society has sold you a dangerous lie that being alone means being unwanted. It's made you so terrified of solitude that you've sacrificed your authenticity just to avoid it. You've become a second-rate version of yourself. What if everything you believe about being alone is backward? What if your desperation to surround yourself with others is precisely what's making you unremarkable? What if the very thing you're running from solitude is actually the source of the power you seek? Have you ever noticed how society has made us terrified of being alone? We run from solitude as if it's a disease. Look around you right now. The person next to you is probably just as afraid as you are. We fill every moment with noise, with distraction, with people, anything to avoid confronting that empty space where it's just us and our thoughts. But what if I told you that everything you've been taught about being alone is backward? What if the very thing you've been running from is actually the source of your greatest power? The caterpillar must enter the cocoon alone. The seed must be buried in darkness. Alone. The eagle must leave the nest and soar alone. Nature understands a principle that humans have forgotten. Transformation happens in isolation. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you were truly alone? Not lonely, there's a difference, but purposefully. Intentionally alone with yourself. When was the last time you switched off your phone? Turned off the television? Closed the laptop? And just sat with yourself? Most people can't remember because most people never do it. We've created a world where being surrounded by others is considered success while being alone is considered failure. Look at all my friends, we say. Look at my busy social calendar. Meanwhile, the person who chooses solitude is pitied. Poor thing. We whisper. They must be so lonely. This is one of the greatest deceptions ever perpetrated on humanity. Because the truth that will set you free, if you let it, is that being alone is not a punishment. It is a privilege. It is not weakness. It is power. Every great idea that has ever transformed this world was birthed in solitude. Every vision that has ever changed the course of history was first seen by someone who had the courage to be alone with their thoughts. Every breakthrough, every innovation, every revolution of thought began with someone who understood the power of aloneness. You see, when you're constantly surrounded by other people, you're constantly influenced by other people. Their thoughts become your thoughts. Their limitations become your limitations. Their fears become your fears. Their dreams, not yours, shape your life. You become a reflection of everyone around you instead of a reflection of who you were created to be. But in solitude, you find your voice. In solitude, you hear your own thoughts. In solitude, you connect with your purpose. There's a reason why the most powerful people in history all practice solitude. They understood that power doesn't come from constantly being in the presence of others. It comes from being comfortable in the absence of others. Hey, now, let me be clear. I'm not advocating for isolation. I'm not suggesting you become a hermit in the mountains, cut off from human contact. That's not what this is about. This is about intentional solitude. Strategic aloneness. This is about understanding that your greatest contributions to humanity will come not from constantly being with humanity, but from regularly stepping away from humanity to hear the unique message that only you can bring back. Think about it like this. If you put a drop of red dye in a clear glass of water, what happens? The entire glass turns red, doesn't it? The unique property of the dye, its redness, spreads throughout the entire glass. But what if you put that same drop of red dye in an ocean? It disappears. Its unique property is lost, diluted by the vastness around it. Many of you are living like that drop of dye in the ocean. You're so constantly immersed in the opinions, ideas, and influences of others that your unique color, that thing that only you can contribute, has been diluted to the point of invisibility. You've lost yourself in the crowd. Being alone is the glass of water that allows your unique color to transform everything around it. Let me share something with you that might shock you. Loneliness and aloneness are not the same thing. Loneliness is a negative emotional response to unwanted isolation. Aloneness is a chosen state of productive solitude. One depletes you. The other fills you. One weakens you. The other empowers you. You can be surrounded by people and feel desperately lonely. And you can be completely by yourself and feel powerfully connected to your purpose. The difference isn't in who's around you. The difference is in how you relate to yourself. The person who can't be alone is afraid of something. They're afraid of their own thoughts. They're afraid of confronting their own emptiness. They're afraid of facing the reality of who they've become. And so they surround themselves with constant noise, constant distraction, constant company, anything to avoid that confrontation. But here's the truth, that confrontation is the doorway to your transformation. When you learn to be alone, you learn to face yourself honestly. You learn to recognize the parts of yourself that need healing, the parts that need growth, the parts that have been neglected in the rush of daily life. You learn to hear your own voice again, not the voice of your parents, not the voice of your friends, not the voice of society, but your voice, the unique expression that only you can contribute. This is why being alone is power. Because it is only in solitude that you discover who you truly are apart from who everyone else needs you to be. I want you to consider something. The most important relationship you will ever have is not with your spouse. It's not with your children. It's not with your parents or your friends or your boss. The most important relationship you will ever have is with yourself. Because that relationship affects every other relationship in your life. If you don't know how to be alone with yourself, you don't know yourself. And if you don't know yourself, what are you offering to others? A stranger. You're offering them a stranger. There's an ancient wisdom that says, know thyself, but you cannot know what you never spend time with. You cannot know what you constantly avoid. You cannot know what you're afraid to face. Do you know why most people's lives never change? Because change requires honest self-evaluation. Change requires the courage to look in the mirror and acknowledge what needs transformation. And that kind of honest self-evaluation rarely happens in a crowd. It happens in solitude. When you're constantly surrounded by others, it's too easy to compare yourself to them. Well, I'm doing better than he is. At least I'm not as bad as she is. These comparisons become the standard by which you measure yourself. And they're a terribly low standard. They allow you to remain comfortable with mediocrity because, hey, at least you're not the worst in the room. But when you're alone, you can't compare yourself to others. You can only compare yourself to your potential. And that, my friend, is a much higher standard. That is the standard that leads to greatness. I want you to try something. The next time you feel that instinctive panic at the thought of being alone, that urge to call someone, to turn on the TV, to scroll through social media, I want you to pause. I want you to recognize that reaction for what it is, fear. And then I want you to ask yourself, what am I afraid of finding if I spend time with myself? What truth am I avoiding by avoiding solitude? Because the answer to that question is probably the very thing you need to confront in order to grow. You see, being alone isn't just about the absence of others. It's about the presence of yourself. It's about creating space in your life where you can hear your own thoughts, feel your own feelings, and reconnect with your own purpose. There's a reason why the wilderness experience appears in every spiritual tradition across history. The desert, the mountain, the forest, the cave. In every tradition, there comes a moment when the seeker must leave the community and enter solitude. Why? Because there are certain revelations that can only come in aloneness. Think about the moments that transformed your life. I'm willing to bet they weren't committee decisions. They weren't group experiences. They were private revelations that came when you had the space to hear the whisper of truth cutting through all the noise. Our culture has programmed us to believe that constant connection is healthy. We carry devices in our pockets that keep us perpetually available to everyone except ourselves. We've become so accessible to the world that we've become inaccessible to our own souls. And then we wonder why we feel disconnected from our purpose. You cannot discover your purpose in a crowd because your purpose is unique to you. It's not something you can vote on. It's not something you can outsource. Your purpose can only be discovered in the quiet center of your own being. And that center is most accessible when you're alone. Let me tell you something that might change your perspective forever. The quality of your life is determined by the quality of your relationships. And the quality of your relationships is determined by the quality of the relationship you have with yourself. And the quality of the relationship you have with yourself is determined by your willingness to spend time alone with yourself. It all comes back to solitude. I've counseled hundreds of people in troubled marriages. Do you know what the common denominator is in almost every case? Two people who don't know how to be alone. Two people who entered a relationship to escape themselves rather than to share themselves. Two people using each other to avoid their own company. That's a recipe for disaster. Because eventually, the distractions fade. Eventually, the newness wears off. And they're left with the very thing they were trying to escape themselves. Only now they've entangled someone else in their escape attempt. If you can't be alone with yourself, why would you inflict yourself on someone else? When you learn to be comfortable in your own company, something magical happens. You stop using relationships as a distraction and start engaging with them as an authentic expression of who you are. You stop needing people and start appreciating them. You stop depending on others for your happiness and start bringing your happiness into every interaction. This is the paradox of solitude. The person who knows how to be alone is the person most capable of true connection. Let me address something I see in some of your eyes. You're thinking, but I'm an extrovert. I get my energy from being around people. I understand that. The power of aloneness isn't about personality types. It's not about whether you prefer social gatherings or quiet evenings at home. It's about your capacity to face yourself honestly, to think independently, and to discover your unique contribution. Extroverts need solitude just as much as introverts, perhaps even more so, because it's less natural for them. The capacity to be alone isn't determined by how much you enjoy social interaction. It's determined by how comfortable you are with yourself. Now, let's talk about something practical. How do you develop this power of aloneness in a world designed to keep you constantly connected? Because make no mistake, there are powerful forces that don't want you to be alone with your thoughts. There's no profit in your solitude. There's no way to monetize your quiet reflection. The machinery of consumerism runs on distraction, comparison, and insecurity, all things that solitude threatens. So here's what you do. You start small. You don't need to retreat to a mountain for 40 days. You begin with 5 minutes of complete aloneness. No phone, no television, no book, no music. Just you and your thoughts. For some of you, those will be the longest 5 minutes of your life. You'll be amazed at how uncomfortable it is, how agitating. Your mind will race. You'll feel an almost irresistible urge to reach for a distraction. That discomfort is telling you something important. It's revealing just how dependent you've become on external stimulation. Then tomorrow, you do 7 minutes. The next day, 10. You gradually expand your capacity for solitude. You train yourself to be comfortable in your own company. During these times of solitude, I want you to ask yourself 3 powerful questions. First, what do I truly want? Not what your parents want for you. Not what society expects of you. Not what would impress others. What do you want? Second question, what am I avoiding by staying busy? There's usually something we're running from when we can't be alone. Some pain we don't want to face. Some truth we don't want to acknowledge. Some emptiness we don't want to feel. Identify it. Third question, what unique contribution can I make that no one else can? This is the question of purpose. And its answer rarely comes in the noise of everyday life. It comes in reflection. It comes in solitude. As you practice intentional aloneness, something will begin to happen. You'll start to hear your own voice again. Ideas will come to you that aren't borrowed from someone else. You'll begin to sense a direction that isn't just following the crowd. You'll discover desires that aren't just reflections of what advertising has told you to want. In other words, you'll begin to become yourself again. And when you become yourself, your true self, not the self you've constructed to please others, you access a power that nothing can take away from you. The power of authenticity, the power of purpose, the power of integrity between who you are and what you do. This is what I mean when I say that being alone is power. It's not the power of isolation. It's the power of individuation. It's the power of becoming who you were created to be instead of who you've been conditioned to be. The world doesn't need more copies. The world needs originals. And you can only become an original by regularly stepping away from the copying machine of social conformity. When you learn to be powerfully alone, you bring something to your relationships that most people never experience, a complete person. Not someone looking to others to fill their emptiness, but someone bringing their fullness to others. Not someone needing others to define them, but someone whose definition is secure regardless of who's around. Let's talk about fear, because fear is at the heart of our inability to be alone. We've been conditioned to believe that being alone means being unloved, unwanted, rejected. And those fears run deep in the human psyche. But what if the opposite is true? What if the inability to be alone is actually what makes us unlovable? What if our desperate need for constant validation and company is what pushes people away? Think about the people you're most drawn to. Aren't they the ones who possess a certain self-containment? The ones who don't need you but choose you. The ones who bring something to the relationship rather than just taking. That quality, that magnetic self-possession comes from knowing how to be alone. It comes from having faced the void of solitude and filled it with self-knowledge. With purpose. With inner resources that don't depend on external validation. Let me put it this way, neediness repels. Self-sufficiency attracts. And the ultimate self-sufficiency is the ability to be complete within yourself. I've watched people destroy relationships because they couldn't bear a moment of solitude. They smother the very thing they're trying to keep. They cling so tightly that they squeeze the life out of love. Why? Because they're using the relationship to avoid themselves. But I've also seen the opposite. I've seen people with the capacity for solitude build relationships of extraordinary depth. They come together not out of desperation, but out of choice. Not to escape themselves, but to share themselves. And in that sharing, something profound happens that the desperate can never experience. When two complete people come together, they don't create a relationship of dependency. They create a relationship of interdependency. They don't need each other, but they choose each other. And that choice, freely given, not desperately grasped, is the foundation of every healthy human connection. Well, some of you might be thinking, this all sounds good in theory, but my life is already so busy. I don't have time to be alone. And to that, I would gently suggest that your busyness is not the cause of your lack of solitude, it's the result. It's a strategy. It's a way of ensuring that you never have to face the discomfort of your own company. Look at how we've structured our lives. We wake up and immediately check our phones. We commute with podcasts playing or calls in progress. We work in open offices with constant interruption. We come home to immediate entertainment. We fall asleep with screens glowing in our faces. We've architected an existence specifically designed to prevent solitude. And we call it connection. But is it really? True connection with others and with ourselves requires space. It requires the capacity to be fully present. And you cannot be fully present if you're constantly distracted by the noise of perpetual stimulation. The irony is that in running from solitude, we've also lost true connection. We've replaced depth with breadth. We've substituted quantity for quality. We know more people but know them less deeply. We have more interactions but fewer relationships. We have more contact but less connection. The path back to genuine connection runs straight through the territory of solitude. I want to challenge you with this thought. What if your avoidance of being alone is the very thing blocking your next level of growth? What if the discomfort you feel in solitude is not a warning to escape, but an invitation to break through? Because growth happens at the edge of comfort. Transformation occurs when we're willing to stay in the space that makes us uncomfortable long enough to be changed by it. Your discomfort with being alone is telling you something important. It's revealing an area of dependency that needs to be addressed. It's highlighting a part of yourself that you've been avoiding. It's showing you where your next growth opportunity lies. Don't run from that discomfort. Lean into it. Explore it. Ask it questions. Let it reveal to you what you've been unwilling to see about yourself. In the quiet spaces of solitude, we encounter not just ourselves, but the truth about ourselves. And while that truth might be uncomfortable at first, it is ultimately liberating. Because only truth has the power to set us free from the prisons we've built with our own avoidance. Being alone with yourself is not punishment. It's not deprivation. It's one of the greatest gifts you can give yourself. The gift of your own undivided attention. There's a difference between choosing to be alone and ending up alone. Many people fear solitude because they don't understand this distinction. They believe that practicing aloneness will somehow diminish their social connections. The truth is exactly the opposite. When you develop the power to be alone, you actually enhance every relationship in your life. You bring to each interaction a fullness rather than an emptiness. You listen better because you're not desperately seeking validation. You speak with more authenticity because you're not afraid of rejection. You love more freely because your happiness doesn't depend on the other person's response. Freedom is perhaps the greatest power that comes from embracing solitude. Most people don't realize how much of their behavior is driven by fear. Fear of disapproval. Fear of rejection. Fear of being misunderstood. These fears keep them in constant need of external validation. They become prisoners to the opinions of others. But the person who knows how to be alone has broken that prison. They've discovered that they can survive, even thrive, without constant approval. They faced the fear of their own company and conquered it. And in that conquest, they found a freedom that most people never experience, the freedom to be authentically themselves, regardless of who's watching. This is why truly original thinkers throughout history have all practiced solitude. It's not that they didn't value community. It's that they understood the necessity of stepping away from the consensus to hear their own thoughts. They knew that conformity is the enemy of creativity. And there is no greater pressure to conform than being constantly surrounded by others. In solitude, the pressure to conform dissolves. The need to perform disappears. The voice of conventional wisdom quiets. And in that quieting, your own voice can finally be heard. Ask yourself this question: when was the last time you had a truly original thought? Not something you read online. Not something you heard in a podcast. Not something you discussed with friends. But a thought that came from the unique combination of experiences, insights, and perspective that is you. If you're struggling to remember, it's probably because you haven't created the space for original thinking. Original thinking requires original space undisturbed by the constant intrusion of other people's thoughts. That space is solitude. The person who masters the art of being alone masters the art of original contribution. They stop being an echo and become a voice. I want to address the most common fear about solitude. The fear that if you learn to enjoy your own company, you'll somehow become selfish or disconnected from others. This fear couldn't be more backward. The person who can't be alone is the one most likely to use others selfishly, to use them as an escape, as a distraction, as a source of validation. True selflessness comes from fullness, not emptiness. When you're comfortable with yourself, you have more to give others, not less. You listen more attentively because you're not focused on what they think of you. You give more freely because you're not constantly calculating what you'll get in return. You love more unconditionally because your worth isn't dependent on being loved back. The practice of solitude doesn't diminish your humanity. It enhances it. It doesn't reduce your capacity for connection. It deepens it. There's a saying that nature abhors a vacuum. When you create empty space, something will always rush in to fill it. The question is, what will fill the space of your solitude? For those who have never practiced being alone, that space initially fills with anxiety, restlessness, and discomfort. But if you stay with it, if you refuse to flee from that discomfort by reaching for your phone or turning on the TV, something remarkable begins to happen. The anxiety gives way to clarity. The restlessness transforms into creativity. The discomfort evolves into insight. The empty space of solitude becomes fertile ground for your authentic self to emerge. And that emergence is the beginning of your true power. We've reached a critical moment in this conversation. You understand now that being alone is not a weakness but a power. You see that solitude is not punishment but privilege. You recognize that your fear of being alone has been limiting your growth, your authenticity, and your contribution. The question is, what will you do with this understanding? Knowledge without application is merely information. And information without transformation is just entertainment. I don't want this to be merely entertaining for you. I want it to be transformative. So let me give you a challenge that could change the trajectory of your life if you accept it. For the next 7 days, I want you to spend 30 minutes each day in complete solitude. No phone, No music, no book, no television, no computer. Just you and your thoughts. During this time, I want you to write down what comes up for you. What fears surface, what insights emerge. What desires make themselves known when all the noise is stripped away. This practice of intentional solitude will feel uncomfortable at first. Your mind will resist. Your emotions may churn. Your body might even feel restless. These reactions are normal. They're the withdrawal symptoms of a life addicted to distraction. But if you persist, if you push through that initial discomfort, you'll begin to experience something profound. A clarity unlike anything you've known. A sense of direction that comes not from external guidance, but from internal wisdom. A peace that doesn't depend on circumstances, but arises from your center. This is the beginning of your true empowerment. Not power over others, but power within yourself. The power to think independently. The power to choose consciously rather than react habitually. The power to create rather than merely consume. Remember this truth: the person who has mastered solitude has mastered themselves. And the person who has mastered themselves cannot be controlled by others. In a world constantly competing for your attention, the ability to be alone with your thoughts is not just a personal advantage, it's a revolutionary act. It's a declaration of independence from the forces that would keep you distracted, reactive, and asleep to your own potential. The journey into solitude is ultimately a journey into strength, not the fragile strength that comes from external validation, but the unshakable strength that comes from knowing who you are and what you stand for, regardless of who's watching. I began by telling you that everything you've been taught about being alone is backward. That society has conditioned you to fear the very thing that could set you free. Now you understand why. There's a power in solitude that can't be found anywhere else, the power of self-discovery, of original thought, of authentic expression. This power threatens every system designed to keep you dependent. It threatens consumerism because a person comfortable with themselves doesn't need constant acquisition to feel worthy. It threatens conformity because a person who listens to their own voice isn't easily swayed by the crowd. It threatens mediocrity because a person who confronts themselves honestly can't remain content with less than their best. The world needs you to embrace this power, not just for your sake, but for the sake of what only you can contribute. Your unique voice, your original perspective, your authentic expression. The cocoon is not the end of the caterpillar's story, it's the beginning of the butterflies. Your solitude is not the end of your story, it's the beginning of your transformation. Being alone isn't just a power, it's your power. Claim it.